recorded testimony of the Seventh-day Adventist church member in good and regular standing and honorably discharged law enforcement veteran of the United States Navy. I became a Seventh-day Adventist in the mid-1990s while on active duty in the U.S. Navy. I met a Seventh-day Adventist family, and their 15-year-old son gave me a copy of The Great Controversy, and that book changed my world view. After studying that book and other related books and sermons and related studies, I decided to be baptized into the Seventh-day Adventist Church based on a first-time understanding of the three angels' messages, the present truth for this generation. Previous to this, I had never heard of Ellen G. White, and I was not aware of the subjects I studied, such as the mark of the beast, the role of America in Bible prophecy, and many other subjects. Since my rebaptism into the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I've supported the Seventh-day Adventist General Conference faithfully with 10% of my income. 100% of my income has always and continues to go to the General Conference Treasury of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I have never directed one penny of God's sacred tithes to any offshoot groups or any organizations outside of the General Conference and the General Conference Treasury. Since leaving the United States Navy, I have served as a full-time literature evangelist in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I've served also in various different departments, including teaching Sabbath school, and I am an ordained elder. It's been years since I've served as an ordained elder, but I continue to support the Seventh-day Adventist Church and also home and foreign missions. While serving in the United States Navy, my duties involved law enforcement and security on naval installations. I've written many police reports. I've been involved in many law enforcement and security and incidents related to terroristic threats to Navy installations, but I've never been in any way the subject of any law enforcement action against me. I've never violated any criminal laws. I've never had any police incident reports related to any violations I've committed. I continue to maintain a clean criminal background. I've held top secret clearance on more than one occasions. My name has never been entered into any local, state, or federal law enforcement databases involving anything whatsoever, except as a law enforcement officer writing police reports related to incidents. I'm a decorated, honorably discharged veteran who served in Iraq, in the Civil War in Liberia, in Somalia, Bosnia, and we conducted an operation in Croatia also to recover the remains of a U.S. official who perished in a plane crash. And I say all this to say that simply, if you were to investigate my relation to civilian life, whether in the military or civilian life, you'll find absolutely no issues relating to any kind of civil or criminal infractions. And if you were to investigate my relationship to God's church, you would find You'll also find that I have a spotless record. In the Seventh Adventist Church Manual, under the section of discipline, we find situations that are grounds for church discipline, to include adultery, marriage and unlawful marriage and remarriage, trafficking, narcotics, issues issues involving violations against minors, pornography, involvement in pornography, and even profanity was mentioned, and also the teaching of heresy. Ministry Magazine, the leading magazine for Seventh-day Adventist pastors, clearly state that there are two grounds for church discipline, and that is unrepentant, overt moral delinquency, or in that article it's mentioned that would be a moral derelict, someone living in open sin, individual that refuses to turn away from an open public course of sin, that at times in cases like these, not only would those without the church know, but those within the church and those without the church are aware of it. Situations like these are clearly grounds for church discipline, as well as publicly teaching or promoting heresy, false doctrines. Ministry Magazine, which is, again, a leading magazine for Seventh-day Adventist pastors, also clearly states that when a church disciplines members for grounds other than the teaching of heresy or living in open sin, the church commits the sin of unholy separation and schism, which therefore thereby brings the church under the judgment of God. So simply put, if a local church disciplines a church member in good and regular standing for frivolous issues, for issues that are not directly to moral dereliction or the teaching of heresy, that church is guilty of the sin of unholy separation and schism, and thereby is under the judgment of God. Since my rebaptism into the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I've always had a good relation with every local church that I have ever been a part of. That will include churches in the South Atlantic as well as Georgia-Cumberland Conference. Churches such as the First Covington Seventh-day Adventist Church in Newton County, Georgia, the Newton County Seventh-day Adventist Church, also in Newton County, Georgia, the Belvedere Seventh-day Adventist Church in Decatur, Georgia, the Conyers Seventh-day Adventist Church in Conyers, Georgia, the Madison Seventh-day Adventist Church in Morgan County, Georgia, and the Loganville Seventh-day Adventist Church also in Georgia. Gwinnett County. I've had a positive working relationship, supportive relationship with all pastors of the previously mentioned churches, Pastor Clinton Valley and Pastor Jackson of the First Covington Church, Pastor Sean Shive of the Newton County Seventh Adventist Church. He's also retired military. We had some difference of opinion at times, and it got difficult. But we were able to reconcile our differences, and I admit at times I could have handled the situation differently, but nevertheless, we had a working relationship. We would knock on doors together and do Bible studies, and in support of evangelistic seminars that Pastor Sean Shives held. Pastor Sean Shives was one of the hardest working Seventh Adventist pastors I ever encountered, and he was very helpful teaching me how to more effectively work for souls. In spite of the differences, again, we were able to reconcile and move on from our differences. Other pastors would have been Pastor Nieves, Pastor Crutcher, and others. And all of these pastors were very supportive, very friendly, very, very, very helpful, unbiased, and I never felt a sense of coldness or standoffishness or being unwelcomed or hated by any of these pastors. However, unfortunately, there's one local congregation and one local congregation only that I have to report as being otherwise, and that is the Meister Memorial Seventh Adventist Church in Deer Lodge, Tennessee. We moved to East Tennessee in 2018, and we started visiting the Meister Memorial Seventh Adventist Church in Deer Lodge, Tennessee. I was cautioned before we moved up to the Cumberland Plateau in East Tennessee. It's the stereotypes about the church members on the Cumberland Plateau and the culture and the people of the Cumberland Plateau is that they are generally racist. I was unaware of this geographical area of the U.S. I've never even visited it prior to the year that I moved. So I was really unaware to give a personal testimony, but the rumors we heard were that even Seventh Adventists on the Cumberland Plateau in East Tennessee are racist. That's just what I heard. Of course, this is not to generalize all Seventh Adventists, but this was the stereotypical or the general idea that I was given by others to be cautious. Upon visiting the Meister Memorial Seventh Adventist Church, there were individuals there that were very kind and very warm. We had a retired pastor from the Michigan Conference that was there, and he introduced himself, and there were other elderly individuals who were very warm and kind and loving. However, the pastor and his family were very unwelcoming, very cold, very standoffish. After visiting this local church for several years, off and on, from a period of from 2018 to about 2020, actually 2018 to 2021, I had never been approached by the pastor. The pastor had never introduced himself to me. The pastor took no personal interest in my family. The pastor took no personal interest in me. I was later told by one of the members on the board that it is their culture. Their culture is standoffish. Unfortunately, I find that to be very true, very cold and standoffish. There were several individuals in that local church who would never speak to us. And of course, being of a minority background, coming to an all-white church in Appalachia, East Tennessee, what other conclusions could we come to but that people like us are not really welcomed here? We did not feel welcome. Efforts were never made on the part of the pastor or his family to welcome us. And to this day, the pastor's wife has never said a word to me. So attending Meister had become extremely painful and unpleasant, but I attended off and on, and then I was asked to teach Sabbath school, and so we started attending regularly, and my children got involved in the Sabbath school because they made some friends in the children's Sabbath school, and we continued to attend regularly, however painful it was to me. I also noticed that the messages at Meister were very watered down, sermons that are no different than the sermons preached in Sunday churches, sermons that are evangelical, sermons that are ecumenical, and sermons that can be preached in any Sunday pulpit without raising any issues. the three angels' messages, the everlasting gospel, present truth, was pretty much completely absent from the sermons preached on Sabbaths during divine worship. There were two sermons preached at Meister that got my attention and concerned me, that they were actually not only evangelical, but they were written sermons that were borrowed from evangelical resources. And I was able to confirm this when I looked on a website called sermons.com, and I found that the two sermons actually were taken from an evangelical website and preached at Meister. So I became very alarmed, very concerned, and for the first time in my life, the unpleasant reality of sitting in a Seventh-day Adventist church but hearing sermons that could in no way be identified as distinctly Seventh-day Adventist messages. Through a series of events, I approached the pastor of this local church with these two concerns. Prior to approaching the pastor and the board about these concerns, I decided to talk to other minorities in this local church to see if there was a pattern of coldness or unwelcoming behavior towards minorities. And after talking to every minority individual and every minority family, families from the Caribbean, family from Mexico, and individuals of Black and other Latino, Hispanic origin, and speaking to all of these individuals, I found out that they had the same testimony that I had, and that is that the pastor absolutely never talked to them, not even once. And that there was no personal ministry, no visitations, no phone call. Simply put, the pastor and his family, mostly people related to him, and those of Appalachian origin, were very cold and standoffish, and apparently unwelcoming to minorities. The pastor one Sabbath introduced himself as a hillbilly, and so I was able to at least classify him because of his own definition of himself. Quote, hillbilly. So after that experience, I started to realize that, so the people up here generally identify as hillbilly. I was previously unaware of that. I wasn't aware of how people in East Tennessee identify themselves. I've heard of hillbillies before, but I could not tell you any strict definition of what a hillbilly is and what region of the United States hillbillies originate from. But from the pastor's own testimony, I realized that he is a hillbilly by identification, and so I realized that these people are hillbilly. However, I can tell you that non-Seventh-day Adventists up here who would identify as hillbillies are very, very, very nice people. One thing I would say about them is that they'll talk to you. Unlike the Meister Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church, I find the people to be very outgoing, and that they'll talk to you. You know, if you're in the store, in a hardware store, in a supermarket, wherever you are, I find that the people go out of their way to talk to you. I tell you, this happens so much to the point where it can be a little uncomfortable, but I've learned to stretch out of my comfort zone, and so I appreciate the culture up here of being friendly and talking and being helpful. For example, I was in a Kroger, and a gentleman approached me, and he identified himself as being from the local Church of Christ, And he stated, there was one time when there weren't a lot of minorities up here. And he says, now we're seeing more and more minorities, and I just want to tell you, make you feel welcome. And I also want to invite you to our Wednesday night Bible study at the Church of Christ in Jamestown, Tennessee. And so here goes a Sunday elder of a Church of Christ approaching me to make me feel welcome. And there are other occasions like that. Pastors of Sunday churches, there have been about 3 different occasions where pastors of Sunday churches have approached my family to make us feel welcome and to personally invite us to visit and join their local church. And the people here are very friendly also. It is very common for people to help you out. If I have a heavy load that I'm loading on a trailer, or one time I had to pick up a couple large boxes at a post office, and there were some veterans standing outside of the little post office in Deer Lodge, Tennessee, which is a predominantly white area with very, very scarcely would you see a black person. But these gentlemen, they offered to help me load the stuff onto my trailer, and I've had many occasions like that. People will generally just take the time to offer you help. So simply put, I speak highly and positively about the people who would identify themselves as hillbilly. Now, I know that the culture up here is racist. Make no mistakes about that, because we've been warned by quite a few individuals about putting our children in public school. And these are white people who, upon finding out that we homeschool, they were very relieved because they know the culture of racism. And unfortunately, we know of some siblings, teenagers, who moved up here temporarily, and they were enrolled in, there were 3 different schools, and unfortunately they heard the N-word and other racial slurs. So the racism up here is definitely ingrained in the culture, but we personally have had no personal experiences with it. So in our own personal testimony, we can only speak highly of these people. Unfortunately, we can't say the same with all Appalachian people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Unfortunately, the only negative experiences, the only cold and bigoted experiences that we ever experienced is in the local Seventh-day Adventist Church in Deer Lodge, Tennessee. So if someone were to ask us, are Seventh-day Adventists prejudiced? Are they racist? Are they bigoted? I can say my only experiences that could indicate that are in the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Deer Lodge, Tennessee. We visited the Crossville Seventh-day Adventist Church, and we have never had an atom of indication of any attitudes of bigotry or prejudice. We speak highly of the Crossville Church. We speak highly of the Cookville Seventh-day Adventist Church and other churches we visited in the East Tennessee area. This is exclusively our experience at the Meister Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church. This is a rogue example and an unfortunate one. So having these 2 concerns, number 1, the serious lack, not only the lack, but the suppression of the truth in the pulpit. The refusal to allow the truth to be preached in the pulpit or in the Sabbath school. For example, there was one time I was teaching Sabbath school at this local church, and after I taught the Sabbath school, which the subject matter was that we are saved from our sins, not in our sins, righteousness by faith. The content that I used was from the Bible, the Spirit of Prophecy, and writings by pioneers like Jones, Wagner, and A.G. Daniels. And the Sabbath school, it was a very powerful but according to the testimony of others who came up to me. And I later found out from a Russian individual who appreciated the Sabbath school. He told me that after I left, because we left after the Sabbath school, because we had to attend another worship service, I was scheduled to teach Sabbath school, so I kept my obligation, but we had to attend another church afterwards. I was told that the pastor got up in the pulpit and his sermon was a complete undoing of the principles that were covered in the Sabbath school, and he essentially preached the new theology that you'll never be perfect until Jesus comes, and don't worry about people who tell you you need to be perfect, referring to me, and that you'll never be perfect until Jesus comes. When Jesus returns in the clouds, then he'll make you perfect. This is heresy. This is pure classic heresy. But this is one example of suppressing the truth, of not welcoming the truth, and of preaching cheap grace. So I brought these concerns to this local church pastor and to the board. Number one, the lack of preaching of the everlasting gospel. And number two, the cold treatment towards minorities. And instead of facing the issues, instead of sitting down and praying and discussing ways to improve certain conditions, the pastor held a board meeting and had me removed indefinitely from teaching Sabbath school or holding any positions in this local church. The pastor obviously was looking for a way to get rid of me, and so he used church discipline as a way to simply to get rid of me. However, as stated before, church discipline, or the grounds for church discipline, are living in open sin and the teaching of heresy, moral dereliction, or the teaching of heresy, which in my case, neither were of any grounds. It was all groundless. But yet, the pastor held a board meeting and manipulated the board for votes to have me removed from teaching Sabbath school. The pastor later contacted me after the board meeting to mislead me to believe that they had followed the church manual. This is a recorded testimony that a phone call by the pastor. I recorded the phone call, and you can find a link to the phone call in the comment section of this video. But in that conversation, recorded phone call, the pastor is stating that he was only present at the board meeting to make sure that the board followed the church manual. However, if they truly followed the church manual, they would have found that they had no grounds for church discipline. The fact is, they did not reference church policy. They did not reference the church manual at all. The board meeting was held without referencing the church manual, either in printed form or online. It was simply ignored. Yet the pastor called me and stated clearly that he was only at the board meeting because he's the chair of the board, and his job is to make sure that the board follows the church manual. The clear evidence that the board never followed the church manual are as follows. First of all, the church manual, church policy, under the section of discipline clearly states that a member who is brought under church discipline must first be given 2 weeks written notice in advance of the board meeting, and written notice 2 weeks in advance of the church business meeting. And neither instructions were followed. They were simply ignored. Not only did I not receive prior notice about a board meeting, but the pastor contacted me after the board meeting without any kind of a written notice. The pastor contacted me after the board meeting to notify me that the board suggests censure under church discipline and that it was the board's idea. However, a recorded testimony, phone call of a board member later, I found out in this recorded a phone conversation. I recorded the conversation with a board member, and the link to that conversation is also in the comment section. You can listen to it yourself. And the board member is stating to me that it was the pastor's agenda to have me removed from teaching Sabbath school and holding other positions. However, he attempted to mislead me to believe that it was the decision of the board to recommend censure. Now, this is a Seventh-day Adventist pastor trying to convince me that the board found that I had done something egregious enough to warrant church discipline, when actually the reasons he was stating himself were vague. In the recorded conversation, the pastors heard stating the grounds for discipline, and the grounds were very confusing. On one part, the pastor is saying that we should not try to influence the local church by our personal views. So he's stating that I'm pushing my personal views on the church. What personal views? That minorities should be treated more respectfully, more kindly, and that the three angels' messages should be preached from our pulpits on Sabbath. In questioning the board about these two issues, the treatment of minorities and a lack of preaching of the three angels' messages, the pastor actually admitted. This was a group text message chat, and I have a copy of all the text messages that were going back and forth. But the pastor actually admitted on this group text message that, number one, the three angels' messages are not preached at Meister. And the reason for this is that the people in this area have never heard of the three angels' messages, and therefore they could not relate to the three angels' messages. So therefore that's why they're not preached at Meister. And so I emphasize reasons why that is the reason why the three angels' messages should be preached at Meister. Because there was a time when I had never heard of the three angels' messages, and I was given a great controversy by a 15-year-old boy, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, I actually could relate to the truth I had never heard of. And so now this pastor has heard on the phone conversation. Again, you can hear it, you can listen to it yourself. Click on the link in the comment section. And this pastor has accused me of, number one, pushing my personal views on a local church. And the letter that they sent me actually stated that they were censuring me from teaching Sabbath school or holding any positions in the local church because I was attempting to push my personal views on the local church. Now, this is a pastor who teaches heresy, who pushes his own personal views on the church. For, as I stated, to state that we will never be perfect until Jesus comes is a personal view. And any intelligent Seventh-day Adventists who have an intelligent understanding of the everlasting gospel know that not only is that heresy, but that is the pastor's own personal view. Furthermore, at different times, different individuals have also pushed their personal views about the COVID-19 vaccine mandate and other controversial issues, personal views being pushed or preached or suggested on God's people. But the problem at the Meister Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church is that Privileges are based on skin color. Freedom of speech and liberty of conscience has a skin color at the Meister Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church. If you're white, you're allowed to speak your mind. You're allowed to exercise your liberty of conscience and freedom of speech. If you're black, you better keep your mouth shut. And if you open your mouth, you'll be dealt with. And I was made to be an example. And so this passed on the recorded phone call is not only misleading me to believe that my personal views are grounds for church discipline, but then in the same breath he's also telling me that Ellen White states that you ought not go in talking about the pastor behind his back and talking about the church in secret. And so you have a Seventh-day Adventist pastor who can read English, who can read church policy, and who can learn clearly who should be disciplined and who should not be disciplined, what are grounds for discipline and what are not grounds for discipline. But yet the pastor is calling me with frivolous charges of pushing my personal views or talking about the church and the pastor in secret. And these were the grounds that were mentioned as warranting church discipline. The pastor stated in the recorded phone call that the board would be recommending to the church and business meeting that recommending censure against me, that I've committed some egregious offenses. Now, the irony about this is that during the business meeting, before the local church assembled in business meeting, the pastor never produced any evidence that I had committed anything that warranted church discipline. The pastor stated that I had sent some text messages to the board, and he painted a picture that the text messages were so egregious that he decided not to disclose the content of the text messages. So in other words, they were to take his word that they were so offensive that he would rather not embarrass me by having the church and business meeting read the text messages. So the church and business meeting took his word and okayed the church board's decision or recommendation for church discipline. The disciplinary procedures went forward without examining any evidence that I actually had committed any violations warranting church discipline. Being a former military veteran, I had a conflict in the U.S. Navy over the keeping of the Sabbath. After I was rebaptized, my conscience would no longer allow me to hold duty on the Sabbath, and I faced charges of dereliction of duty and disobeying the orders of superior officers who became cruel and ordered me to hold duty on Sabbath, even though I clearly gave written testimony that my conscience would no longer allow me to hold duty on Sabbath. They tried to force me to hold duty on Sabbath, and in refusing to do that, I was slapped with multiple charges of dereliction of duty and disobeying the orders of superior officer. I faced court-martial, and during the court-martial hearing, I actually would have faced several years in prison. But I noticed the due process and the professionalism in a military court-martial, and that is commanders. When you go before your commanding officer, military commanders cannot punish an individual service member unless they strictly follow the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And during the court-martial judicial proceedings, a legalman is present to advise the commanders of military codes, military policy, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The legalman is there to advise the commander on the charges and the applicable punishment. And the commanders are not allowed to assign any punishment independent of strictly following the physical manuals present before the legal men, referencing them in physical paperback form, advising the commander, and the commander is not allowed to assign any punishment independent of the Uniform Code of Military Justice being interpreted and advised by a legal man. So in the military, we have due process, we have the rule of law, and there is professionalism. A service member is allowed to be present, to face his accusers, to examine the witness, the evidence, and to question witnesses. And this is in the military. This is among men who kill and who die for this country. Yet, in this church, in this local church, the Meister Memorial Seventh Adventist Church, I was never given a formal written notice as per church policy. I was never given a formal written notice to attend either the board meeting or the business meeting. And the pastor and the board members cannot produce any such evidence to the contrary. I was never given the opportunity to be present, to face my accusers, to examine the evidence. Simply put, there was no due process. The pastor acted like a dictator, and the church board and the church in business meeting simply allowed him to have his agenda. After the board meeting and the business meeting, I investigated, I researched church policy, and I saw the clear policy violations, the clear violations of the Bible and the spirit of prophecy, and I also realized the nature of the so-called disciplinary action were punitive, to punish and to get rid of, rather than being restorative and redemptive. And I brought this all to the attention of the pastor and the board. I clearly showed them that their church discipline was groundless. Two members of the board also acknowledged during the business meeting that the charges were groundless, that there were no grounds for church discipline. They knew this, and they discussed this among themselves during the church business meeting, but they never raised their hands to insist that the proceedings be stopped and further examined. They discussed among themselves that if the church in business meeting would examine the text messages, they would see clearly that they were not grounds for church discipline, comparing them to instructions in the church manual concerning discipline. The board members who could have stopped the proceedings simply remained silent and discussed it among themselves. So after bringing all the clear evidence of violation of church policy, the church pastor, the church board refused to rescind their illegal, their immoral violation of church discipline, bringing groundless, frivolous censure for simply voicing concerns about how minorities are treated and the lack of preaching messages that reflect the primary duty of Seventh-day Adventist pastors and evangelists and missionaries. The Seventh-day Adventist pastors in the Georgia-Cumberland Conference, when they're employed, at the time of their employment, they sign a contract clearly agreeing that their duty chiefly is to preach the everlasting gospel of the three angels' messages. And so if you are a non-Seventh-day Adventist watching this, just know that there are Seventh-day Adventist pastors who choose to mimic Sunday pastors. They choose to reflect the messages, the sermons of Sunday pastors. They choose to act like Sunday pastors in Seventh-day Adventist pulpits. And this is done with the excuse that to not offend visitors. So therefore, if you're a Baptist or a Methodist or from some other denomination, if you were to attend the Meister Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church in Deer Lodge, Tennessee, you would actually not hear a distinctive message that is Seventh-day Adventist, but rather you would hear messages quite the same as messages that you would hear in your Sunday-keeping church. And this is ironic. This is very unfortunate, because if you were to visit a Jehovah's Witness church, Latter-day Saints, Mormon church, or Amish or Mennonite church, or any other denominations up here in East Tennessee, you would clearly be taught, especially the Jehovah's Witness and the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, you would walk away knowing clearly what they believe. Yet they want you to visit their local Seventh-day Adventist church. The pastor talks about going out and working for souls and inviting people, and yet they want you to visit their church to hear messages no different than you can hear in your own church. Of what use would it be to visit a Seventh-day Adventist church to hear a Baptist sermon? If I were a non-Seventh-day Adventist visiting a Seventh-day Adventist church, or I would expect to learn exactly what Seventh-day Adventists believe. The everlasting gospel of the three angels' messages. If I chose to visit a Jehovah's Witness church, I would expect to hear what Jehovah's Witnesses believe, because that's the reason why I'm attending a Jehovah's Witness church. And likewise with a Mormon or Latter-day Saints or any other denomination, if I chose to go outside of my denomination to attend another church on Sunday, on a given Sunday, I'm clearly stating by my presence there that I am here to learn what you people believe. But unfortunately, the Seventh-day Adventist pastors, not all of them, but there's a growing condition among Seventh-day Adventist pastors that are ashamed to preach the everlasting gospel of the three angels' messages, that take a salary from the sacred tithes, but they do not uphold the duties that they assigned a contract agreeing to do. They're not doing their job. They're not carrying out their primary mission of preaching the three angels' messages, yet they continue to receive a salary from the sacred tithes and not carrying out a duty that they signed a contract instructing them to do. And this is my story of the groundless church discipline, of the bigoted church discipline that I experienced, church discipline so-called in the Meister Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church of Deer Lodge, Tennessee. Simply put, if you are a Seventh-day Adventist, you should be alarmed. If you're a non-Seventh-day Adventist, you should also be alarmed that an honorably discharged member of the U.S. military, a Seventh-day Adventist in good and regular standing, calling the pastor to simply preach, function in his primary duty as a Seventh-day Adventist minister, and being persecuted for doing it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening.
The latter part of that, the last action, the same formation. So you need to just press the voices to rescind.